The sharp hum of engines echoed inside the small cockpit as Rand gripped the control panel tightly, his eyes scanning the worn buttons and flashing lights. The coordinates of his target planet blinked on the screen, almost mocking him with their simplicity. An uncharted world, designated only by a number with sparse data describing its dense jungles and strange atmosphere. The planet loomed closer, its green and gray surface shrouded in thick, swirling clouds. It was beautiful but unsettling, like a predator hidden in plain sight. Rand leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. This wasn't his first mission into the unknown. As a seasoned scout working for a shadowy intergalactic agency, he had charted countless planets, dodged hostile life forms, and unearthed secrets best left buried. Yet there was something about this place that made his gut tighten. Just another job, he muttered to himself, as if saying it aloud would calm his nerves. The first sign that this wouldn't be just another job came moments later. His ship shuddered violently as it entered the planet's atmosphere. Rand gritted his teeth, gripping the controls as alarms blared. The turbulence was stronger than expected, nearly overwhelming the ship's stabilization systems. Damn, what is this place made of? He growled, wrestling with the controls. The clouds parted just enough to reveal a sprawling jungle below. Massive trees stretched endlessly in all directions, their thick canopies forming an almost impenetrable roof of green. The atmosphere looked alive, vibrant, and shifting as if the planet itself was watching. Rand made quick adjustments to stabilize the ship, his eyes narrowing as he selected a landing site on the outskirts of the jungle. With a heavy thud, the ship touched down, the engine sputtering to a halt. The silence that followed was oppressive. Rand sat there for a moment, letting the tension drain from his shoulders before unbuckling his harness. Time to see what's out there, he murmured. He murmured. Shh. He murmured. Stepping outside, Rand was immediately hit by a wave of heat and humidity. The air was thick, carrying an unfamiliar, almost metallic tang. Sweat beaded on his brow within seconds. He adjusted his gear rifle slung across his back, scanner in hand, tactical boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, and took his first steps into the jungle. The landscape was breathtaking in its alien beauty. Towering trees, their bark a deep shade of blue-gray, rose like cathedral columns. Vines as thick as his arm dangled from the branches, their surfaces glinting faintly in the muted light. Strange, luminous insects flitted through the air, their soft glow casting dancing patterns on the forest floor. Every few steps, Rand's boots crunched over colorful fungi, some of which seemed to pulse faintly when disturbed, but it wasn't just the sights that unnerved him. The jungle was alive with sound, the constant rustle of leaves, the distant calls of unseen creatures, and a low, almost rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. Rand paused, scanning the area. No signs of intelligent life yet, he noted into his recorder. Atmosphere stable but feels dense. Like walking through a dream, the deeper he ventured, the more the unease grew. His scanner occasionally picked up strange energy readings, fleeting blips that vanished before he could identify their source. Several times he thought he saw movement in the shadows, shapes too large to be mere animals, but every time he turned, there was nothing there. Just nerves, he told himself. But the sensation of being watched was impossible to shake. Hours passed as Rand documented the flora and fauna. The scanner's memory filled with images of strange plants and bizarrely shaped animals, some of which scurried away at his approach. Yet there were no signs of structures, tools, or other indicators of sentient life. Disappointment mingled with relief. A barren planet might mean a safer mission, but it would also be another lonely trek through the wilderness. As the sunlight dimmed, Rand found a clearing to rest. Sitting against a tree, he sipped water from his canteen, eyes scanning the jungle's edge. He was no stranger to isolation, but something of this planet's silence felt different, oppressive, like the jungle itself was holding its breath. Then he heard it, a soft rustling, distinct from the usual ambient noise. Ram froze, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. The sound grew louder, coming from his left. His pulse quickened as he crouched low, keeping the tree at his back. Through the dense foliage, something moved. A figure, for a split second, Rand thought it was an animal. But as the figure stepped into the clearing, his breath caught. It was a woman or something like one. She was tall, her skin a shimmering shade of green that seemed to blend with the jungle. Her hair, long and intricately braided, was adorned with beads and feathers that glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the jungle's hum. Her eyes, a piercing amber, locked onto his with an intensity that made him forget how to breathe. Ron's training kicked in. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at her. "Stay where you are," he barked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. She froze, her expression shifting from shock to fear. Slowly, she raised her hands, palms outward. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, as if trying not to startle him. But Rand didn't lower his weapon. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Woman didn't answer. Instead, she spoke in a soft, musical tone, the words unintelligible but filled with emotion. Rand couldn't understand her, but the pleading in her voice was clear. She wasn't a threat, at least not an immediate one. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, locked in a fragile standoff. The jungle around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual hum fading into a tense silence. Finally, Rand exhaled and lowered his rifle slightly, though he didn't let go of it entirely. "All right," he said, his voice softer now. "Let's try this again. I'm not here to hurt you. Just don't come any closer." The woman nodded, her posture relaxing slightly. She lowered herself to her knees, her hands still raised, as if to show she meant no harm. Her amber eyes never left his, filled with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and something deeper that Rand couldn't quite place. The encounter left Rand more unsettled than he cared to admit. He was no stranger to danger, but this felt different. The woman's presence was otherworldly, but not in the way he had expected. She wasn't hostile, but there was an intensity about her that made him wary. As the minutes passed, she seemed to grow more confident, cautiously pointing to herself and saying a word that sounded like Naira. Rand hesitated, then responded in kind, pointing to himself. "Ran." She repeated his name softly, her voice lilting in a way that made the single syllable sound musical. Their tentative exchange was interrupted by a distant noise, a low rumble, almost like thunder but more mechanical. Rand's head snapped toward the source, his heart sinking. The sound grew louder, closer, unmistakable now. The hum of engines, Naira's eyes widened in alarm. She pointed urgently toward the jungle, speaking rapidly in her strange tongue. Her fear was palpable, and Rand didn't need a translator to understand what she was trying to say. Danger was coming, the low hum of engines grew louder, a stark reminder that Rand was far from alone on this planet. He turned to Naira, her amber eyes wide with fear as she gestured urgently toward the dense jungle. The word she kept repeating, though incomprehensible, was laced with panic. Rand didn't need a translator to understand the urgency. "All right, we need to move," Rand said, motioning for her to follow. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and grabbed the scanner, its faint beeping confirming what his instincts already knew. Multiple heat signatures were closing in. Fast, Naira darted into the underbrush with the fluidity of someone born in the jungle. Rand followed, his boots sinking into the soft ground, his every movement clumsy compared to her. Branches whipped past his face as they weaved through the labyrinth of trees and vines. The air seemed to thicken with tension, every rustle and crack amplifying his awareness of the approaching danger. After what felt like an eternity, Naira led them to a concealed alcove beneath the roots of a massive tree. She crouched low, her breathing steady despite the frantic pace. Rand dropped to one knee, gripping his rifle tightly as he scanned the surrounding jungle. The sound of engines had faded, replaced by the faint but unmistakable crunch of boots on the forest floor. Mercenaries, Rand muttered under his breath, recognizing the disciplined rhythm of their movements. He peered through the scope of his rifle, catching glimpses of dark figures moving methodically through the trees. Their tactical gear gleamed faintly in the dim light, and their weapons sleek, high-tech, and deadly were a far cry from the standard issue gear Rand carried. Naira tugged at his sleeve, her eyes pleading. She whispered something in her native tongue, but it was her gestures that conveyed the message. They weren't here for him. They were here for her people. Rand's grip on the rifle tightened. He'd seen their type before, contractors hired to clear the way for resource extraction, unburdened by the ethics of wiping out indigenous populations. These weren't scouts or scientists, they were hunters. Rand tapped his earpiece, activating a local frequency jammer. It wouldn't last long, but it would slow the mercenaries down. "Listen," he said, keeping his voice low as he turned to Naira. "I'll draw their attention. You need to get back to your people and warn them." Naira shook her head vehemently, her hands gripping his arm with surprising strength. She spoke quickly, her tone resolute. Rand didn't understand her words, but her meaning was clear. She wasn't going to leave him behind. "Fine?" Rand relented, glancing back toward the shadows moving through the jungle. "But we're going to have to outsmart them?" Naira nodded, her fear tempered by determination. She motioned for Rand to follow as she led him deeper into the jungle. The terrain grew denser, the air heavier, but the mercenaries' movements didn't falter. They were closing in. Using Naira's knowledge of the jungle, they began setting crude traps, tripwires fashioned from vines, spiked branches positioned to fall. Ren marveled at how quickly she worked, her movements a blur of precision and instinct. When the first trap sprung, taking out one of the mercenaries with a sickening crunch, Ran allowed himself a grim smile. But the satisfaction was short-lived. The other mercenaries adjusted quickly, moving more cautiously, their comms disrupted, but their formation intact. Ran and Naira managed to stay ahead of them, but the gaps between close calls were shrinking. The tension was palpable as the chase stretched into hours, every moment a test of endurance and strategy. Just as the mercenaries seemed to lose their trail, Ron's scanner picked up a new signal, a larger group. Advancing from the west, Naira's face fell as she realized what this meant. Her people's village was directly in their path. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the jungle as Naira and Ran arrived at her village. It was nestled within a grove of massive trees, their branches forming natural shelters. Dozens of figures emerged from their hiding places, their expressions a mix of relief and fear as they saw Naira. Their skin shared the same shimmering green hue, their eyes filled with a quiet wisdom that spoke of centuries of coexistence with their environment. Rand felt the weight of their scares as Naira spoke rapidly to an elder, her gestures frantic. He didn't need to understand the language to recognize the gravity of the situation. The elder turned to Rand, his gaze piercing. "They don't trust me," Rand muttered under his breath. He couldn't blame them. To them, he was no different from the mercenaries who had invaded their home. Naira placed a hand on the elder's shoulder, her voice firm but gentle. She pointed to Rand, then to herself, and finally to the jungle beyond. Whatever she said, it seemed to sway the elder, who gave a reluctant nod. "I hope you know what you're doing," Rand said to Naira. She offered him a small, reassuring smile before turning back to rally her people. The village erupted into quiet but urgent activity. Using limited resources, Rand and Naira helped the villagers prepare for the inevitable attack. Traps were set along key paths, and makeshift weapons were distributed. Rand shared his knowledge of guerrilla tactics, demonstrating how to use the jungle's density to their advantage. Despite the preparations, the atmosphere was heavy with fear. These people were not warriors. Their lives had been spent in harmony with their surroundings, not in conflict. Rand could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they hesitated to handle the weapons he offered, but Naira was different. She moved among them with quiet confidence, her presence a source of strength. When she spoke, they listened. When she worked, they followed. Rand couldn't help but admire her resolve, even as he worried about what lay ahead. Night fell, and with it came the first wave of mercenaries. The traps along the outer perimeter worked as intended, taking out several soldiers before they even reached the village. But the mercenaries were relentless, adapting to the environment with alarming speed. Rand took up a position near the village's edge, his rifle trained on the shadows. His military instincts took over as he fired controlled bursts, picking off enemies with practiced precision. Naira, armed with a makeshift spear, moved through the chaos with surprising agility, her intimate knowledge of the terrain allowing her to evade and outmaneuver the attackers. The villagers, though inexperienced, fought with a desperation born of survival. Every successful strike was met with a surge of courage, but the losses were mounting. Rand could feel the tide turning against them. As the fighting dragged on, Rand's scanner picked up a new signal. Another group of mercenaries, larger than the first, was advancing toward the village. They were out of time. Rand turned to Naira, his voice urgent. "We can't hold them off forever. We need to evacuate your people." Naira hesitated, glancing at the villagers who were still fighting, their faces etched with determination. She spoke a single word. One Rand didn't understand, but her expression was clear. She didn't want to abandon her home. "Listen to me," Rand said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You can rebuild, but not if you're all dead. Get them to safety. I'll buy you time." Naira's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her resolve hardening. She began calling out orders, rallying the villagers to retreat toward the river. Rand stayed behind, his rifle at the ready, knowing he might not make it out alive. The mercenaries' second wave hit with brutal force. Rand used every ounce of his training, setting off improvised explosives and picking off soldiers from cover. He moved like a ghost through the jungle, his every action calculated to delay and confuse the enemy, but the mercenaries were relentless, and Ron's resources were dwindling. His muscles burned, his breathing ragged, but he refused to stop. He could hear the villagers in the distance, their footsteps fading as they made their escape. Just as Rand thought he couldn't hold out any longer, a deafening explosion rocked the jungle. He turned to see a massive tree collapsing, crushing several mercenaries beneath its weight. Naira emerged from the shadows, her face streaked with dirt and determination. She had stayed behind to fight alongside him. The second wave of mercenaries advanced with brutal efficiency, their coordinated movements cutting through the dense jungle. They adapted quickly, using high-powered scanners to navigate the chaotic terrain. Rand and Naira had slowed them, but it was clear they wouldn't be able to hold their ground much longer. Rand crouched behind a large fallen log, his rifle trained on the advancing figures. His breathing was labored, his muscles aching from hours of fighting. Beside him, Naira gripped her spear, her knuckles white. Despite the fear in her eyes, her resolve hadn't wavered. "We're running out of time," Rand muttered, reloading his rifle. "They're closing in fast." Naira nodded, her face set in grim determination. She motioned toward the river in the distance, where the last of her people were making their escape. "They must reach the water," she said in halting English, the words strained but clear. Rand met her gaze, a plan forming in his mind. "I'll hold them here," he said, his voice steady. "You go. Make sure they get across safely." "No," Naira said firmly, shaking her head. Hide from her head. Her voice softened as she added, We fight together. Before Rand could argue, the jungle erupted with gunfire. The mercenaries had found their position. Bullets tore through the foliage, forcing them to scatter. Rand rolled behind another tree, returning fire with precision. He saw Naira dart through the chaos, her movements swift and unpredictable, her spear finding its mark with deadly accuracy. As the fight intensified, Rand used the last of his explosives to trigger a landslide, blocking one of the key paths the mercenaries were using to advance. The ground shook as massive boulders crashed down, buying them precious time. Naira, meanwhile, rallied the few villagers who had stayed behind to fight. They used the terrain to their advantage, setting ambushes and forcing the mercenaries into choke points. Though poorly armed, their intimate knowledge of the jungle made them formidable opponents. But the mercenaries were relentless, their superior technology giving them the upper hand. Rand's scanner pinged with an ominous warning. Reinforcements were on their way. His heart sank. We can't keep this up, he thought grimly. Not against those odds. The realization hit Rand like a punch to the gut. If the reinforcements arrived, there would be no escaping the mercenaries' wrath. The villagers, already vulnerable, would be slaughtered. The only way to ensure their survival was to eliminate the current threat entirely. Rand turned to Naira, his expression grim. We need to draw them away from the river, he said. If we can lead them deeper into the jungle, away from your people, we might have a chance. Naira hesitated, her eyes searching his. She seemed to understand what he wasn't saying, that this plan might cost them their lives. Finally, she nodded. We go together, she said softly. The two of them moved swiftly, drawing the mercenaries' attention with a series of well-placed distractions. Rand fired his rifle, hitting key targets and forcing the soldiers to pursue them. Naira used the jungle to her advantage, luring them into traps and ambushes. The plan worked, but at a cost. Rand was hit in the shoulder during one skirmish, the peen nearly blinding him. Naira helped him keep moving, her determination unwavering despite her own injuries. Together, they led the mercenaries into the heart of the jungle, far from the river. In a clearing surrounded by towering trees, Rand and Naira made their last stand. They used the dense foliage for cover, picking off the remaining mercenaries one by one. The fight was brutal and chaotic, every moment a test of their endurance and willpower. Rand's ammunition ran out just as the last mercenary lunged at him. He barely managed to fend off the attack with the butt of his rifle, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion. Naira, bloodied but unbroken, delivered the final blow, her spear striking true as the jungle fell silent. The weight of what they had accomplished settled over them. They had survived, but only barely. Rand and Naira limped back to the river, their bodies battered and bruised. The villagers, now safely on the other side, greeted them with relief and gratitude. The elder approached, placing a hand on Rand's uninjured shoulder. Though he said nothing, his eyes conveyed everything: respect, gratitude, and an unspoken promise. Naira knelt beside a group of children, her expression softening as they clung to her. Rand watched from a distance, a strange mix of exhaustion and pride washing over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he had done something truly meaningful. Over the following days, Rand stayed with the villagers, helping them rebuild what they had lost. He shared his knowledge of tactics and survival, teaching them how to defend themselves against future threats. The villagers, once wary of him, began to accept him as one of their own. Naira stayed by his side, her presence a constant source of strength. Together, they worked to fortify the village, setting traps and creating escape routes. Though the threat of the mercenaries lingered, they faced it with newfound confidence and unity. As they spent more time together, Rand and Naira's bond deepened. They shared stories of their pasts, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. Rand found himself drawn to her resilience and compassion, while Naira saw in him a strength tempered by kindness. One evening, as they sat by the river watching the sunset, Naira spoke quietly. "You stayed," she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "You could have left, but you stayed." Rand met her gaze, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You gave me a reason to," he replied simply. The days turned into weeks, and life in the village began to stabilize. Rayon, once a lone wanderer, found himself embracing his role as a protector and teacher. He taught the villagers not just how to fight, but how to think strategically, to anticipate threats and adapt to challenges. Naira, too, grew into a leader. Her people looked to her for guidance, and she rose to the challenge with grace and determination. Together, she and Rand began laying the foundations for a future where the villagers could thrive, even in the face of adversity. Despite their progress, the threat of the mercenaries loomed large. Rand knew it was only a matter of time before more soldiers arrived, drawn by the reports of their failed mission. He and Naira prepared the villagers for the inevitable, ensuring they were ready to defend themselves. "We can't stop them forever," Rand admitted one night as he and Naira stood watch over the jungle. "But we can make them think twice about coming back?" Naira nodded, her expression resolute. "As long as we stand together, we will endure." The story ended not with a neat resolution, but with a promise. As Ran and Naira stood side by side, watching the horizon, they knew the future was uncertain, but they also knew they were no longer alone. Together, they had forged a bond that could withstand even the greatest challenges. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, illuminating the jungle with golden light, they faced the new day with hope.